State Representative Joe Sosnowski represents Illinois' 69th District, which includes portions of Boone and Winnebago counties. A member of the Illinois General Assembly since 2011, he is an advocate for families, taxpayers, and job creators throughout the state line region. Representative Sosnowski is a graduate of Northern Illinois University. Go Huskies. Madeline, he's a Husky. He was twice elected to the Rockford City Council, where he served as First Ward Alderman until being elected to the Illinois House of Representatives. He was also Director of Institutional Advancement at Rockford Christian Schools until 2020. Representative Sosnowski is a member of State Line Community Church and lives in Rockford with his wife Roxanne and their 3 children. Thank you for joining us today to give us a State of the State address, and we really appreciate all that you do and look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate the warm welcome, and I'll let you know I did watch the predecessor's speech, Mr. Maurice West, and so I'm messing with this microphone. I clocked him at about 47 and a half minutes, and so I'm going to try to beat that. But mayors, anybody else, if I get to the 20-minute mark, just hold your hand up, and I'll try to wrap it up in the next couple. Oh, already? Well, you got to give me a couple minutes. But thanks so much, and thanks to all the elected officials here, and especially to all the institutions and businesses that are represented. You job creators in those businesses, colleges in our community. You're out there on the front lines hiring people, keeping our local economy working. So thank you for all that you do, and appreciate your ability to continue working despite what Springfield may create for you as far as problems. So. Speaking of Maurice, just a couple of quick comments. So I should have brought his slideshow with, but I didn't have a copy of it because I could have just added some edits to it as we went along. But I may take the liberty of doing a little bit of that. But I obviously shared a lot of numbers with those of you who were able to attend last time. So I won't go into all that depth, but I will touch on some of what happened with the state budget and kind of give a synopsis. But Tanya, thanks for having me. She also recommended that he cried at the end of his thing. Now, this is all Hollywood, people. You got to understand this. He's got like this squeezy button thing that pumps out tears, and he's got this little line run around his ears. So don't believe any of that nonsense. I mean, he has fit right in with the Springfield crowd and the bunch of actors that are down there. So, but no, in all seriousness, I've enjoyed having Maurice, and it's great for us old timers because we got to have these young rookies who want to come and present here first, so we can mark all the things they did wrong, and then hopefully our presentations are a little bit better. And then he's just, he's a ball of fire. He wants to go to every little meeting, whether there's 3 people there or not. And it's great because people call my office. I'm like, you know what? I got the perfect person that can come and visit your group of 5 people and give a presentation. So here's his number. Maurice, thank you very much. It did crack me up, though. I think his child is 18 months, 2 years, somewhere in that range. And he was talking about how one kid gave him gray hair. I'm like, are you kidding me? Wait until you got 3. And they're all different ages. And my oldest is getting ready to go to college in another year. Then you'll know what gray hair is. So anyways, I'll dig on Maurice a couple more times throughout my presentation. But I wanted to give a little synopsis of what we kind of experienced in the recent General Assembly that concluded. As you know, the best decisions and the best policies are made not at midnight or 1 a.m., but at 6 a.m. On the last day of session when stuff's just being crammed into people's hands. You've got literally budgets that are thousands of pages long being amended last minute, passing between 2 chambers. And that's exactly what happened again this year. In fact, this year was worse than prior years. And I don't know if we got to blame a new speaker or not, but it was literally 6 a.m. in the morning before the General Assembly adjourned. And it is, it's obviously it's not the best way to make public policy and pass a $49 billion budget with billions and billions in appropriations and new spending. And we've advocated, and I've advocated for years, we've got to get to a better process where final budgets are at least given time, not just for legislators, but for the public to have a couple days to at least digest what's being proposed. But we have not yet been able to get to that point in Illinois. And I'll add, it's very interesting. I'll sometimes meet with colleagues from other states, and it's amazing. This is not how it's done everywhere. I've met colleagues in Colorado, for instance. They have bipartisan budget-making committees. They work together throughout the entire process. They go through the entire spring session. I mean, there's different, goals and agendas at the end, and they'll vote on some things, but the entire budget process is done in a bipartisan manner. So we definitely have things that we need to do to improve the process. But generally speaking, we've been able to, I guess, as Springfield, we could say, we've been able to drink out of a fire hose for about a year and a half. We've been flooded with federal money, all levels of governments. The state of Illinois got $12 billion in federal funds. And really, unfortunately, we've spent every dime of that. And, so you'll recall just 2 years ago, there was lots of money spent on how we absolutely needed to increase our income tax rate in the state of Illinois, and that was essential to fund the operation of government. Well, we haven't had much of that talk, now that we're entering into campaign time and election year this year. But all of that money has been spent. Maurice was accurate. There was $1 billion set aside for a quote-unquote rainy day fund. But essentially, all the operations of government were funded and expanded. In fact, we spent, even though we brought in 5% more, we ended up spending 10% more in actual dollars than we did in a prior year. So we'll see what this all looks like as we fast forward into this upcoming year and we start working on the budget. The biggest problem, and it's continued to be there, and I'll touch on some of these things throughout, we're still at about 12.6 billion people living in the state of Illinois. And I was talking with a gentleman earlier today here. And the problem is if we just grew like our neighbors, Wisconsin, Iowa, Indiana, they've all grown about 1%, 1.5%. You can do the calculation fairly easily, and we'd have over 1 million additional people living in Illinois over the last 10 years if we just grew like our neighbors did. And that is a big problem because instead of growing, we've actually lost a small share of population. And what that means is, yes, state coffers are filled right now. There's been a little bit more money coming in because of success of business. Inflation has generated artificial increases in government income. So we've seen all of those things happen, but we don't have a population base that's going to continue to grow as of right now until we make drastic changes. So a couple notes on what was in the budget. I mentioned that a lot of it came from federal dollars. So we were able to plug a lot of holes with that extra $12 billion. I will note one of the biggest travesties I think of this past session was our unemployment fund. The reason the federal government set aside a lot of those funds for state governments were to really shore up our unemployment fund. Those of you who are business owners, accountants, you understand how the unemployment fund affects you. They set, in this budget, a little bit of money, about $1.5 billion was set aside to plug that, but unfortunately we still have almost $2 billion in unfunded liabilities in just our unemployment fund. So as of right now, that's on a trajectory to cause a higher cost for businesses and or employee contributions will have to increase, or a mix of those things. And so instead of plugging that, we kind of just kick the can down the road, which for some reason we're famous for doing that in Illinois. But another thing that we also, hold on, I'll get to that in a second. So also tied to that then, I touched on it briefly. They took $1 billion, set aside that money, and basically gave tax breaks in a variety of different areas. And so those are outlined here. I won't go into all the details, but essentially a temporary 6-month freeze on gas, part of the gas tax, 6-month on groceries. There's some additional holidays for back to school, property tax rebates, and a couple other things. Essentially, that adds up to about $1 billion, and I think we're going to be sending out some checks too. It depends on number of kids, but everybody enjoy your couple $100 that you'll get in the mail, and apparently that will help solve some of our problems. But again, when we're just left 2 years ago with a governor saying we need $6 to $8 billion in more taxes, fast forward to 2 years, we spent all the federal money, And then we do a 1-year tax break. Oh, I forgot to mention that. This tax break is only for 6 months on some of the categories, and then only on a year, and magically after election time, it'll revert back to the normal route. It's probably, I agree, probably most of you would agree that it's probably not the best way to create a budget, especially for a state that has struggled historically. Second major thing I just want to point out, kind of an end of session wrap-up, was really no action was taken on criminal justice and the Safety Act reform. Again, I won't go into all the details. Some of you that are mayors or in law enforcement understand a little bit more about how this has handicapped police around the state. But I can tell you right now, we have a drastic problem, partially because of COVID, partially because of issues that happened over the last couple of years. But our law enforcement communities need to be supported, especially in the state of Illinois. There's no doubt that there's problems, there's bad actors, but I would argue that there's bad actors in every profession out there. And yes, we need to work on additional training, we need to do better safeguards, we need to have more supervision. I don't have any issue with the institution of body cams as long as the state can help some of those communities that may not have the money in their budget. So all those things I think we can agree on. But the tone that we've kind of exacerbated in Illinois is truly driving people away from the law enforcement field. I mean, you don't need to go too far. Macomb, Western Illinois, well known for law enforcement training. You can ask some of your cities, managers and mayors, hey, how's the application pool looking for new police officers? It's an extremely tight field, and there's not a lot of people going into that. And by some of the restrictions and laws and what was put into place, that not all of it's taken effect, we've just exacerbated that situation in Illinois. And we literally have other governors and other mayors and other states actively recruiting our law enforcement officers. Some of the items in the I'll fast forward here just for a second. So just to touch on it real quick, I won't go through all of these, but some of these items that were passed as part of this Safety Act legislation, again, not all of it goes into effect right now, was changing guidelines for enforcing laws. If somebody trespasses on your property, they changed the law, and now a police officer can respond and can offer a ticket or give them a ticket, but can no longer remove that trespassing individual from their property. That's not a good way to enforce the law in Illinois. Getting rid of cash bail has not really been proven to work very effectively in other areas that have tried that. And we don't need to go too far to see what's happening in the city of Chicago with crime rate is increasing in a lot of different areas, whether it's carjackings, burglaries, domestic violence. They're seeing increases in a lot of different areas. And then in addition, I mean, we have some other problems with, how the state's attorney in Cook County prosecutes or maybe doesn't prosecute. But it's those types of approaches where we just want to slap the wrist of somebody who violates the law. That's not a preventative measure. Now, does that mean I'm not for rehabilitation and training and working with folks? Absolutely. Low-level crimes like drug offenses, we don't need to be flooding our prisons with people that have had drug offenses in the past or minor violations, one-time offenses, or maybe 2 or 3 when they were younger. There's a lot of things that we can work on with those. But literally, we're letting people out. In Cook County, this has happened a couple times. You can check the Tribune, the Sun-Times, Daily News. It may be a domestic violence situation, somebody with, physically attacks somebody. I mean, they're out in a couple hours and they're back on the street. This is not a good way to create safe neighborhoods. So, I talked about body cams just briefly. Again, city managers, mayors, the timeline, but, we kind of set out a process over, a couple years here, so it'll culminate in 2025. So, those requirements, which again, I think is a good part of that law, but again, it was mandated without a lot of support, especially for smaller municipalities who could struggle to pay that. And that's, really unfortunate because it was legislation that was slammed through. Both parties weren't brought to the table. Law enforcement wasn't brought to the table. a lot of this could have been worked out in a, not only a bipartisan manner, but just let's bring experts in. Let's bring the state's attorneys around the state. Let's bring law enforcement. Let's bring those agencies that judges. Bring everybody together and let's pass a law that makes sense. So I touched on that. So really what happened with that legislation was really not much. There's been a lot of proposals, a little discussion about what we could do. There's been some different bills that have been proposed. But really the only thing that has been changed, it talks about it here, was now if somebody is arrested, and again, I don't really have a problem with this per se, but they get 3 phone calls. If they shift from one facility to another, they get 3 more phone calls. So the other side will say, well, we helped amend the Safety Act and we fixed some of the problems by, they'll say this is the criminal justice reform to fix that legislation. Well, we really didn't do that. Also, something I mentioned that I didn't mention that was in there, anonymous complaints against law enforcement officers. You guys all have Facebook accounts, Twitter. I mean, when is it a good idea to just have random anonymous people make complaints that could be foiable in public against officers and they're not willing to put their name behind it? If somebody is a victim and, there's certain situations, maybe we could create some safeguards around that where they can go to a different law enforcement agency, make that complaint, but to just have anonymous complaints against officers was not something that I see as a favorable part of, and that will be going into effect soon. And then I already talked about the bottom part with monetary bail or cash bail. So I just want to talk about some of the ongoing problems that weren't taken care of. So I talked about overall budget picture. We talked about population in Illinois and how we're flat. We're not growing like other states. And I didn't add, Iowa has about the same weather as we do, so they're still attracting more people to live there. I talked about the unemployment, so we have that $1.8 billion that was just left there, a problem to talk about in the future. We still have north of almost $200 billion in unfunded pension liability. I'll elbow Maurice a little bit later when I talk to him tomorrow or the next day. I know, they did say we put extra money towards the pension, but that was really just what we were supposed to pay with a tiny bit extra. So that's just our standard annual payment that we need to put towards the pension. We have not made any changes to any pension laws or any of our obligations. So we still have all the same problems that have existed for many decades now. And it's still going to be a continuing growing problem, especially as we see the population potentially continue to stay flat in Illinois. In regards to ethics, again, there's a lot of discussion on ethics. The biggest thing that we could do on ethics reform is, number one, put in term limits, and number two, have fair maps. The mapping process, for any of you who ever follow it, and almost nobody does, it's absolutely amazing. They've got everything down to every block and house and household. They know who you are, voting patterns, and we draw legislators out of districts. We draw legislators together in districts. And when I say we, it's whoever's in charge. And so Republicans and Democrats, depending on what state, are both guilty of this. And it's just not fair to the voters. The best policy would be to have as many 50-50 districts as possible and try to keep cities together so that representation is more holistic. And again, both parties do this depending on what state. So we just, at some point, hopefully we can see some help from either federal courts or federal government in order to change that. What else? Madigan's gone. I believe Maurice did mention that, and I will give him props for that. Him and several of his colleagues certainly were the impetus to help drive him out of the legislature. And so I think we'll see some benefits of that and just that lack of consolidation of power that's happened for such a long time. The fact that, you had one rep who represented the same number of people that I represent, out of this little ward office in Chicago, just controlling all wheels of government and the patronage that went along with that. And we'll see more and more come out, I think, in the court proceedings. But, everything down from making sure that friends' kids got internships to, these neighborhoods, the lights got repaired quicker than those neighborhoods, because an election was coming up, to all these, revolving door of lobbyists and lobbying money and fundraising revolving around Madigan. I think we'll see a dissemination, at least in that power base. So I think that'll be a positive thing. But really outside of that, there hasn't been any real change in any ethics reform in Illinois. So, whether we're talking about campaign finance reform, spending limits, things like that, we haven't been able to get anything passed through the legislature. Property taxes, you all know that. I don't need to tell you that. You all got friends in Tennessee, Alabama, Arizona, Florida. They send you property tax bills and they laugh at us, and it's not very funny. Our houses are the same as theirs, except they pay 50% less. Other than that little minor credit that I mentioned under the tax cuts that were passed, again, just on a one-year basis, this is another area in Illinois that we're struggling in. We've got to reduce our property tax liability for both residential and commercial entities. I talk to businesses all the time in the state line region between here and the Chicagoland area, and it's so easy now for businesses that are very complicated to pick up, shift their operation. These are high-skilled jobs, manufacturing jobs, high technology jobs. If they can find a deal in another state, they're gonna look to move. And having the second highest property taxes is not an attractive tool for just naturally bringing more job creators to the table. You all know this. Inflation. We're obviously going to be struggling with inflation. That's going to hit everybody, especially at the pump. For those who can't afford it the most, between food and gas, it's going to be a huge problem. It's something that we are going to have to probably get back to Springfield and look to figure out how we can address this and kind of take care of some of this immediate impact. And then I skipped over the one. And then executive orders. I think most people are pretty much ready to be done with the pandemic. Obviously those who are have either chronic illnesses or things that they need to be careful, or the elderly, there's definitely precautions that all of us should take on an individual basis. We're still under executive orders. The governor just signed another one declaring a state of emergency, continuing to push down rules and regulations to different areas. Mostly in the areas of nursing homes, long-term care, facilities like that, but there's a whole slew of other things that he is continuing to run by executive order. And, executive orders have their place. They were originally designed, the intent would be for 30 days, not for 30 months. It's not a democratic state when you have a legislature and you have a governor and you're supposed to pass a law and have that signed by the governor. All the governor needs to do is have legislation passed granting him some of these powers for a period of time. But unfortunately, what we've seen with the majority party is, and really this goes back to Madigan, he just said, hey, you know what, Governor, you just take care of everything. We're going to let you run it, and you take all the blame. And so it was a great way for Madigan at the time just to kind of dust his hands off and say, I don't have any part in this, but it's not healthy for long-term status of our state or for a democratic elected body. And it really puts a limitation on the legislature, no matter what party's in charge. The fact that we haven't had any oversight committees called, we haven't evaluated any of the governor's major offices, IDPH on down. There hasn't been any checks and balances in that entire process. And I think that, unfortunately, what we've seen, and a couple of years from now, everybody will go back and the experts will look at kind of the 50-state response to COVID. And I think what we're going to find, and what we're already starting to see initial numbers, is that most states were essentially the same. Illinois had the 5th highest population. Unfortunately, we had about the 5th highest infections and the 5th highest deaths. It really just kind of tracks population. And, I think whether states opened or had universal mandates, you're not seeing big dramatic changes in the overall numbers. All right. Well, I feel like I had to give a little bit of dreariness to follow up on all the positive stuff that has come out in the past. But I think by identifying our problems, and I don't mean to go through just a litany of what our issues are, but we can't ignore them. We have got to identify these issues, and we know what all of them are. We've been talking about them. They're big, big budget items. The pension alone and the health care unfunded liability, when you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, we have to start addressing this now. And you're not going to get it all done in 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years, but we're not even setting up a pathway to showing that we can get that done. And so we need to come together. Both sides of the aisle have to do this together, but we've got to fix that. We've got to be able to show movement in the property tax rate. And by doing this, you'll see areas start to turn around. You'll see businesses start to consider Illinois again. But we're in a 50-state competitive environment, just like all of you business folks. You're competing against fellow businesses that are all trying to get your customers. It's the same thing with state government. And if we're not competitive on the basic benchmarks, it's going to hurt us overall. Doesn't mean we can't turn it around. We're best situated in the nation. We're smack dab in the middle of the country. Massive highways interconnect right through Illinois. Railroads come right through Illinois. We got a lot of connectivity. Ports, we've got Lake Michigan. We've got a great city in Chicago that with some small changes, we can do a lot of good and we can reverse the trend that we've seen in Illinois. So I look forward to continuing to work with all of you to do that. If the state of Illinois just ran like all of you run your businesses and nonprofits and organizations locally, we would have no problems. So kudos to all of you. We just need to use you as an example down in Springfield, and hopefully that'll be a good example to right the state and move in the right direction. So thank you so much for having me. Hopefully, Mayor, I don't know if you were clocking it. Hopefully I was somewhat a good timeline, but I don't know if there was a Q&A format, but I'm certainly available. If not, I'll be available afterwards, and I'll stick around to talk to you individually. But thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.